I'm Stephen Duckett, Director of the Health Program at the Grattan Institute, and I'm here on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in the headquarters of the Independent Hospital Pricing Authority to talk to you today about an introduction to activity-based funding. So although my day job is Director of the Health Program at Grattan, I've had a long involvement in activity-based funding, starting back in the 1980s actually, but most importantly in 1993 with the introduction of activity-based funding in Victoria, and then I've kept an interest since then. So what I'm here today to do is to talk to you and to just give you a brief introduction to activity-based funding so that you can understand the various ways in which healthcare can be funded in any country, and in particular where activity-based funding fits into that. And then we'll move on to talking about activity-based funding itself and how that works and what that's all about. And then we'll come down to Australia, because those two bits are generic in a sense, and talk about funding flows in Australia. So I hope this goes well. I hope you enjoy yourself. So just think about an issue. Let's say you've started as a new director of hospitals in your country, or in your state for that matter. And you've got these big hospitals and small hospitals, say 30 big hospitals and dozens of small hospitals. And in your first week on the job, commodity prices drop. And for your country's biggest exporter. And so suddenly you've got a funding crisis and you have to make a 10% cut in hospital spending. Well, and you've got no information to do it. How on earth will you do it? Do you just say, okay, we're doing a staff cut, boom, across the board? Or we're going to close all of the small hospitals? Or we're going to actually cut half the beds in the 10 biggest hospitals? This issue of how we manage our finances, how we manage our resources, is a critical one for every country, every state, every health service. And obviously, when you're faced with that, you've got to make some choices. That was a decision that I was faced in back in Victoria in the early 90s, where a new government came in and said, we're going to do a 15% budget cut. And so I had to face this choice. How was I going to do a 15% budget cut? The traditional way is just slice money off the top. Traditional hospital response, close beds. The result of that, waiting lists blow out and so on. What I said was, let's try and do that in a way which is about improving efficiency. Let's try and do it in a way which is sensible, not just dumb cutting. And that's where we started with activity-based funding in this country. We started by saying, let's use it to make sure to protect the health system so it forces the hospitals to address efficiency issues, and so we protect activity, so we protect the public so that waiting lists don't blow out and so on. So, the dumb old ways are the dumb old ways. So I want to start by putting some parameters around what we're talking about. The object of health policy is to change the behaviour of individuals, professionals, organisations, communities and so on. So we're on about change. And we've got a limited number of levers about how we might do that. One of the levers, obviously, is a price lever. It's about financial incentives. It's about changing the behaviour of organisations, especially, or people, or whatever, by changing the nature of the financial incentives on them. And this is typically, when people think about activity-based funding, they think that is what activity-based funding is all about. It is, in fact, what activity-based funding is about, but not all about. Because if you're going to have activity-based funding working successfully, you can't just have a pricing lever. You've got to actually empower the organisations to respond to the incentives you're putting on them. Because if they can't respond, then your pricing lever, your financial incentives make no sense. And so a second important element of activity-based funding is making sure the health services have information so they know where they stand. Are they more expensive on average than all the other hospitals? Are they on a par, or are they cheaper on average than all the other hospitals? And so a key element, a key prerequisite, I guess, of activity-based funding is you've got enough information. And my view is not only enough information, but enough information at a granular level so that you know whether your orthopaedic service is more efficient or less efficient and so on than anybody else's. That's not what activity-based funding is all about either, because a third important component is the regulatory environment, the rules. So, for example, when we introduced activity-based funding in Victoria, we issued a new set of rules, which we called the conditions of funding, and they had in it a whole set of things which are about the rules that you operate on. For example, before we did activity-based funding, hospitals were pretty slack on sending in their data. You know, it would come in months and months later. So we had a set of rules about how quickly people had to send their data in, for example. So there was a whole lot of rules about the way in which activity-based funding is going to work. We also required information from health services, and we said, you have to provide information about your costing systems and so on. So a third element is these rules and regulations, the way things work. Another element is rhetoric. Rhetoric is important. So what we're saying here is that you've got to say, for example, efficiency is really, really important, but we are not interested in efficiency if it comes at the expense of quality, for example. And so you've got to be careful about what messages you send to the health system. You know, is coming in on budget the only thing that matters? Well, if you're the public, no, it's not. What the public wants is access to high quality services, and they're less interested in whether the hospitals come in on budget. So politically, it's really important that you actually nuance the message to say efficiency is important, but it fits within a broader context. Now, I've got up there on that slide lots of levers. In fact, there are 8 of them. And it's really important that they're all aligned, that you don't send financial incentive signals which are inconsistent with other messages you're sending and so on. So that's where we start. So activity-based funding sits in a context and has a number of elements to it. So now I want to move on to talking about what the various ways in which healthcare can be funded and their strengths and weaknesses. So what we're on about in this particular area, what the fundamental principles of activity-based funding, it's all about holding hospitals to account. You know, it's a really important thing. A whole lot of money is spent on hospitals, and so you want to make sure you're getting value for money. You want to make sure that the hospitals are working efficiently. And in the olden days, it was really hard to measure what hospitals did. And so the typical ways of what hospitals did was measured by the total number of patients treated or the total number of bed days. And of course, and then they compared hospitals' cost per patient treated, cost per bed day. But of course, these things are meaningless unless you account for the mix of patients, so-called case mix. And so activity-based funding is all about, we now know how to measure what hospitals do. So let's hold hospitals to account for what they do, including the costs of what they do. So again, we've got to put activity-based funding in its context. Efficiency is not the only thing that policy is all about. And in the United States, they've developed this thing called the Quadruple Aim. Now, I've got there's a number of weaknesses of this, but it's a good way of thinking about these things. And I'll mention some of the weaknesses, one of the weaknesses in a minute. But so if we start by saying, really what the health system is about is getting better health outcomes. It's about trying to actually reduce mortality rates or improve the cure people, get them back to work and so on. So a critically important aim of the health system is better health outcomes. And the process of getting there is important as well, improving the patient experience so that they feel they're treated with dignity and so on. It's about making sure into the long term we've got the staff. We actually want to make sure the staff experience is good. And finally, doing all that with a lower cost of care. So we've got 4 aims of the health system, not just one, the same point I made previously. Now, what's interesting in this is that each of these aims are about the health system as a whole. So we've also got to look at how it works for different types of patients. Is the patient experience for people with from a culturally and linguistically diverse background the same as the patient experience for people from a white Anglo male background, for example, Indigenous versus non-Indigenous, and so on. So we've got to look behind the average into the distribution and in particular into the outcomes for individual different groups of patients. The other thing that's interesting is here is all of these are active verbs about improving, reducing. So it's a dynamic aspect that, you know, the health system changes and so too should the management, the policy environment around the health system. But in this discussion today, we're principally focusing on that last one about lowering the cost of care, and activity-based funding is a critical component of that. Importantly, activity-based funding is neutral as to savings. It can drive efficiency. That's how we started in Victoria, trying to get 15% lower cost. But it depends where you set the price. And so you can set the price so there's no savings, it's just get redistributed, or you can set the price so there is savings. We'll come back to that later. So, activity-based funding is not the only way you can pay hospitals. In the olden days, last century, we used to pay hospitals on the basis of history, plus or minus a couple of percent, typically minus a couple of percent, but efficiency dividends they were called. But essentially, we assumed that there was some rational basis in funding hospitals. In my very first job in the health system, I was working at a place called Prince of Wales Hospital, and we had to open a whole lot of new beds, and basically we were funded on the basis of staff. You know, opening these beds means we have to employ this number of staff, and so the budget of the hospital was increased to pay for that number of staff and equipment and so on. That's funding on the basis of inputs. Or you can fund on the basis of negotiations, and another word for that is politics. Those ways of funding have sort of gone out the door. We don't do that anymore. And we've moved now to more price-based systems of funding. And there are different ways you can go to do that. You can go out to tender and say, we're interested in providing another 5,000 patients treated. How much are you prepared to, you know, how much do you want to get paid to do that? Very, very rare to do that, but in private-public partnerships, this is often the way it works. You can fund on the basis of services provided, but you've got to put a price on each service. You can fund on the basis of the population served, and so you might say, we are going to fund X area health service based on some sort of weighted formula for the number of people served in that population. Pretty hard to do in Australia, where you've got the majority of procedures done in the private sector, but it's still advocated in some circumstances. But even if you fund an area on the basis of their population served, the area still has to fund the hospital somehow, and it might use inputs, it might use something else. But activity-based funding is about this. It's about funding hospitals, paying for hospitals on the basis of their activity, activity-based funding. And one of the future issues that we'll mention later on is, do you adjust that for outcomes or not? But you certainly have to adjust the funding of the hospital based on the mix of patients. And so that is what it's all about. And in order to fund on the basis of patients treated, you need to be able to describe the patients. And finally, there's a nirvana, which is paying on the basis of outcomes. No one's ever done that, but lots of people talk about it. It's one of the unicorns of health policy. You talk about it a lot, but no one ever sees it. So these different price-based ways differ on their incentive effects. If you pay on the basis of number of patients treated, unless you're careful and in your design, there's an incentive to treat more patients. If you pay on the basis of capitation, there's an incentive to treat patients less. And you've got to deal with how you're going to manage that. So they have different incentives, obviously. And they differ in the ability in which you can hold health services to account. If you pay on the basis of services provided, for example, you're not necessarily able to incorporate some other aspects of holding hospitals to account in terms of the mix of services. So if you're paying on the basis of how many meals are provided or how many days are provided, that doesn't necessarily get you very far in terms of measuring efficiency properly. And you can also think about who bears what risk. So to what extent is the funder responsible for variations in epidemiology, if there's a COVID epidemic, for example. So how did this all come about? This critical issue of describing the patients. Well, there are a couple of stories about how it came about. But one of these stories is about John Thompson, who was a professor of nursing at Yale University. And he got interested in looking at cost variation. And the critical question about cost variation is describing what the hospitals do. So he had to think about how would you describe what hospitals do. Simultaneously, there was a policy change in the United States, and they introduced systems of utilisation review, because the US health system is very expensive, and they were looking at the question of overutilisation of hospitals, and in particular length of stay variation. And so this organisation, who was supposed to be overseeing this utilisation review activity, got in contact with a guy called Bob Fetter, and they wanted to say, well, we want to actually compare length of stay, and we want to know, can we reduce length of stay? Now, Bob Fetter was an industrial engineer. Anyway, so these two people got together and they had a useful collaboration. Thompson, a nurse, Fetter, an industrial engineer. And so they came together, and what they got interested in is, how do you define the normal patient? Originally they said, the utilisation review organisation said, we want you to define the abnormal patients, the patients who stay too long, so we can review their care to understand why they are staying too long. And Bob Fetter said, no. If I want to define the abnormal patient, I first of all have to define the normal patient, and then the abnormal patient falls out. Pretty obvious when you think about it, but it's a good and important insight. Just as an aside, Bob Fetter was married to Audrey Fetter, who was a hospital manager at Yale New Haven Hospital, and so presumably over the dinner table he got sort of hospital management advice as well. Anyway, so his insight was that normal to abnormal. And there was another insight we'll come to in a minute. Anyway, so how on earth do you define what normal is? Well, there are actually two ways of defining normal. Well, the first broad answer is groups of patients which are similar to each other. And what on earth do we mean by similar to each other and groups of patients? Patients who have a similar patterns of care. And similar had two meanings. The first meaning was similar in terms of resource use, length of stay, for example. And the second meaning was similar in terms of clinical meaning, that when you wrote down the description of the patient, a clinician would understand it. Oh yeah, I know what that sort of patient is. And that was called resource homogeneity and clinical homogeneity, if you like long words. Anyway, so he used diagnoses as the first information, and he had particular criteria that if he was going to do this sensibly, he had to use the routine data, so only data which was already collected and available in computerised form. And so he said, okay, let's start by using diagnosis as how we define these groups of patients. Really important when you're talking about clinical homogeneity, that you talk in a language that clinicians understand. Again, something I'll come back to. Anyway, so this led to the name diagnosis-related groups. Remember, we started with groups of patients. He split by diagnosis, so they're diagnosis-related groups. And this classification system has evolved for inpatients, and we're now up to version 10 of the Australian Refined Diagnosis-Related Groups Classification, homegrown Aussie classification. However, that classification only describes acute inpatients. Starts with diagnoses. Now, some other classifications, diagnosis isn't where you want to start. You might start by broad area of care, or you might want to start with presenting problems or whatever. But anyway, there are a number of other classification systems we now have in Australia, including classification systems for mental health, subacute care such as palliative care or rehabilitation, emergency department care, and so on. So I'll be mostly talking about acute inpatients, but the same principles apply to every one of these different sorts of classifications. And they're all aiming to do the same thing. They're all aiming to create groups which are similar clinically and where the patients cost roughly the same amount of money. So I want to come back to this question of DRGs. And I've said a number of times, it's not only about efficiency. And I told you the story about where they came from for a reason, because Bob Fetter was really important that, in his view, that DRGs were not just a funding mechanism. They were about trying to improve health service management, trying to improve hospital management, that the starting point was about utilisation review, quality of care. Why did people stay longer in hospital and others didn't? And so in the United States, and from Bob Fetter's point of view, and these Fetter's own words, the original goal of DRGs was to facilitate hospital management by providing a system that would allow the measurement and evaluation of hospital performance. So we're talking about an improvement focus, where I started from a while ago. We're talking about broadly trying to improve hospital performance. And the use of DRGs has expanded dramatically over the years. It's not only about financial management now. So I said there were two insights that Fetter brought to the table. The first one was defining this normal versus abnormal patient. The second one was about what on earth we were trying to measure. Remember I said way back in the dim distant past, hospital days, number of patients treated. Then we started talking about number of meals, a number of patient days, a number of lab procedures and so on, services provided. So what Fetter said is what we're really on about is the treated patient. That is why someone goes to hospital, they're going in with pain and they have an appendectomy because that's what they needed, or what is important is these products, in a sense, even though that's a marketing type word, but this was the focus. And what Fetter said we should be interested in these things is what is the cost for a patient with chronic obstructive airways disease and major complexity. And so the principal measure about activity-based funding is this one. This is how hospitals get paid. However, it doesn't mean we've thrown all this out. They're still there. You still employ staff and so on. And so it's important that you still manage that staffing stuff, really important. It's important you measure and manage how many meals, days, lab procedures and so on. But these are, in a sense, inputs or intermediate products for this final products. And once you can describe it, it is possible and logical to pay on that basis, which is where activity-based funding came from. Now, there are lots of measures you can have, cost per day or cost per test or whatever. So measures down here, length of stay, another measure there, cost per DRGX, really important, but these two contribute to that third one. Cost per weighted patient, more important. Down the end here, risk-adjusted mortality rate, moving into a quality measure. And of course, looking at a longitudinal approach, cost per quality adjusted life year is also important. Now, the good thing about focusing on products is it started to create this common language, clinical homogeneity, resource homogeneity, creating a common language. So on the one hand, we have clinicians sitting there, and the clinician sort of talks about a patient who comes in with an inflamed appendix. The manager talks about DRG G07B. What on earth do I mean by that? Come back to that. And that costs $7,400, or that the payment for that is that. And the common language is this DRG language. The DRG G07B happens to be an appendicectomy with minor complexity. And so there is the manager, the clinician. Now, I don't want to imply that managers are only interested in money, far be it. I'm a life member of the Australian College of Health Service Executives, so I better not say anything nasty about them, but this is what DRGs allow you to do. And where did that $7,042 come from? Well, there is a thing called a price weight, and I'll explain later where we get a price weight, which for this DRG happens to be 1.2583, and there's a thing called the base price, multiply that by that, and you get $7,042, if my arithmetic is correct. Now, I said DRG G07B. Is this just a random collection of numbers? Well, as it turns out, every DRG, remember we're only talking about acute inpatients, every DRG is a 4-digit alphanumeric number. The first of those is alpha, alphabetical. And that comes from the body system, like diseases and disorders of the circulatory system. And it's in health information management speak, the major diagnostic category. Not quite true, because there are some pre-categories and so on, but it's essentially the body system. The last digit, the second digit, the second 2-digit is what I've called here the adjacent DRG. So you've got a body system, and then you want to split up the body system. So you start with diagnosis, which is part of the body system, and you want to split it up. And the first way of splitting it up is, was there an intervention? Was there a procedure? And if there was, you go into the first cluster, and that their numbers run from 0 through to 59. And yeah, that's the first numbers. And if it didn't have an intervention, that is, it was a medical admission, their numbers run from 60 to 99. And obviously, when we're talking about appendicectomies, G07B, 07 was, or 07, it was an intervention. And it was the 7th group of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And the ordering within the procedural hierarchy, or the procedural break, is ordered in terms of complexity. So the lower the number, the higher the average complexity, roughly speaking. Similarly, within the medical hierarchy, the lower number, the higher the complexity. And the final thing is the split. It's G07B. So we've got G07, and then there's A or B. And that's splitting this adjacent DRG into differences in complexity. And the idea is you do enough splits so you've got good explanatory power, and the DRGs are resource homogeneity, resource homogeneous, and there's sufficient difference between A and B, for example. So the last letter can either be A, B, C, D or Z. And so some DRGs are just not split at all. Renal dialysis is an example of that. And in fact, there are a total of 397 adjacent DRGs, 87 of which are not split at all. Just one DRG for that adjacent DRG. Most of the DRGs are split just into A and B. Generally major complexity and minor complexity, words that effect. Some are split ABC and some are split ABCD. So that's what the last digit is all about. And here we have an example. So what we have here are these circulatory disorders, and most of these ones are procedural related, invasive cardiac investigations, for example. And I've got some here which are procedure, and these two are medical. And what I've got along here is the relative, is the price weight. And so what we've got here is, it shows you that F40A, for example, is more than 5 and a bit. And so these ones are bigger than these ones are bigger than these ones. So you can see that particular hierarchy. And then we move, or this was bigger than that. Anyway, so then we move on to medical. Now, if you give those names to clinicians, they would understand what you're talking about. And these have been defined to be resource homogeneous as well. Now, the other important thing is there's a huge difference between the cost of this one and the cost of this one. About a 10-fold difference in the price. So it's really important, obviously, that you are able to describe the patients in a meaningful way, and so you can hold hospitals to account for that. So that's what the basic mechanics of the classification system. I now want to go on and talk to you a bit about the different types of payment system. I touched briefly on that at the start, but basically there are a range of ways of funding hospitals and services. Up here, I've talked about capitation. We talked about that before. Down here, we've got activity-based funding per episode, per diem, fee for service, and just cost reimbursement. Remember, right back at the start, I said what we're interested in is how these methods have different ways of, different attributes in terms of holding hospitals to account. And one of the ways of looking at that is in terms of the risk profile. Who bears what risk? And on this graph, for example, at this end of the spectrum, if you're paying hospitals on the basis of their cost, the hospitals are laughing. They bear almost none of the risk of cost variation, for example, because they get paid on the basis of cost. And the poor old payer bears most of the risk for cost variation. If, on the other hand, you're way up here, then the provider now bears almost all of the risk for cost variation, and the payer bears almost none. They just pay on the basis of capitation. And obviously the risk profile varies for the different types of payment system. Now, this graph crosses neatly at activity-based funding, episode funding being the perfect system where the risks are balanced, but that's just an artefact of the graph, as a matter of fact. So this is illustrative. Remember what I haven't shown in this graph, it's all about payer risk and provider risk. I haven't talked about consumer risk and the consumer's interest. They're just not considered in that presentation, but you've got to think about which of those have which risks for consumers as well. Now, each of these payment systems, as I said, have different strengths and different ability to hold health services to account. Different incentives, If you pay on the basis of fee for service, for example, very strong incentive to increase the number of services. If you have a global budget, you say we negotiate a budget and you're going to get $1 billion next year regardless of how much activity you do, very weak incentive on the health service to do any more activity. And hospital, if you pay on the basis of DRG, it's somewhere in the middle, and I'll point that out in a minute and why that is. Expenditure control, almost no ability to control expenditure. Strong ability to control expenditure with a global budget, and depending on how, in some design aspects, you might get expenditure control. Quality improvement, potentially strong here with fee for service. I'll come back to that. Technical efficiency, the sort of the doing the thing right. Very strong incentive here for improving efficiency. And what about doing the right things? You know, cost-based fee-for-service reimbursement runs the risk of activity increase, saw over there, might be low-value care, so weak on allocated efficiency, moderate. So you see that DRG payments got on this criterion, moderate across most of them. So whether this actually works in terms of controlling activity depends on the capping mechanism. In activity-based funding implementations in Australia, services budgets are typically capped, and so how do you cap it? And whether increasing activity, whether you've set the prices for increased activity so the cost to the health service at the margin is actually less than the revenue they'll get or greater than the revenue they get. If it's less, they'll have an incentive to increase. If it's greater, they won't. In Australia, we've introduced quality incentives alongside the DRG payment. So there are some incentives for improved quality. And this question about global budgets, whether it's moderate or not, depends on how you do transition from year to year. So various aspects of design can change the nature of the incentives. So let's turn to what we know about the results. And down on this slide, I cite, and you can see it on when the slides become available, a systematic review, of which I was one of the co-authors, about the impacts of activity-based funding. And there are mixed results on efficiency because it partly depends on where you set the price and what your pre-existing arrangements were. There's very clear evidence there's an increased use of rehabilitation, partly because if you're paying for acute services on the basis of their activity, and you can unbundle the acute from the non-acute, the subacute, and pay for the rehab separately, then there's an incentive for that unbundling. And so there's increasingly people get discharged to rehab. I'll just tell you an aside, when I was chair of the board of Alfred Health in Victoria, we introduced a new short stay procedure centre, what I called an elective surgery factory, but we said maximum length of stay is 3 days. Very quickly, all the orthopaedic surgeons changed their practice, so all the joint replacements were done in less than 3 days, either discharged home or discharged to Caulfield, our rehabilitation centre. So that was a building strategy to change what we did, but anyway. So, and so these are clear results that happens with activity-based funding. So I've talked to you about the way health services funding and a bit of that. I'm now going to talk to you in more detail about the key elements of activity-based funding. Remember, I started with what I call my petal diagram about most people think that activity-based funding is only the financial incentives, but don't forget it is also the sets of rules that within which activity-based funding works. And of course, we need information to enable us to manage. So we've had this time frame of activity-based funding. So because I'm talking to you from IHPA, the Independent Hospital Pricing Authority, they start the world sort of just near when IHPA was established. Some of those are a bit older than IHPA, and we start the world back in the 1980s. when I did a study tour of activity-based funding, case mix funding in the United States, and we implemented activity-based funding in Victoria in 1993. And then there was this National Health and Hospital Reform Commission, which made a whole lot of recommendations about improving the health system. And we said, well, how on earth are we going to, I was a member of the commission, how on earth are we going to pay for this? Well, one of the ways is to improve the efficiency of hospitals. And so we recommended as well the introduction of activity-based funding nationally. And it became part of the Commonwealth payment to hospitals. That was signed off in the National Health Reform Agreement, where all the states said, we'll do activity-based funding now. And it also established the Independent Hospital Pricing Authority, because it was ideal that we have consistency across the country. And in 2012, in this period here, the Independent Hospital Pricing Authority developed the pricing framework, and I was one of the consultants involved in the development of that pricing framework back then. And you can still see the archaeology of our pricing framework in the current ones. And then they established the first national efficient price, national efficient price 12 at $4,808. And then the national efficient price only works for big hospitals. Small hospitals, it doesn't work so well, because basically it's the staffing requirements that drive the costs, and so they develop what they call the national efficient cost. And I'm not going to talk much about that. And through to today, when the national efficient price NEP 21 is $5,597. So, as I said, activity-based funding has two basic components: the payment design, the payment rules. And it also dramatically changes what the Central Health Authority should be doing. So in the olden days, you set a budget. Nowadays, you set an activity target and a price. And then the health service has to decide, you know, what its budget's going to be, given what it projects in terms of activity, given in terms, and so it changes the way you should have the Central Authority thinking. So it thinks more about allocating targets and monitoring, and less about micromanaging. And the service management role, the hospital role, becomes determining the budget, making sure your costs are actually less than your revenue, managing to budget, managing your revenue, and watching adherence to the rules. Because there might be rules on what happens to your waiting times, for example. And so there should be. Now, I've talked a lot about acute inpatients, but I've warned you that there are other classification systems, and the rules for how activity-based funding varies. And, you know, so you've got different payment streams often for inpatients and outpatients, although they're all within this national efficient price and price weights process, and the rules about what's an inlier. That is, you remember right at the start I said, what's the normal patient and what's the abnormal patient? Well, the current terminology is the inlier patient. That is, the patient who fits easily within the DRG, and their costs are roughly within that, a reasonable range of that price. And then there are patients who are outside that, either because they're higher cost, longer stay, or because they're less, you know, and so they're called outliers. And there are rules about how you define an inlier, how you define an outlier. Then you say, well, I'm now talking about the ordinary everyday patient, someone like me who lives in the inner suburbs of Melbourne, you know, but what about a patient who lives remotely? There are all sorts of reasons why a remote patient may be more expensive. Sometimes you have to wait a day or two to get a plane to take them home. You know, there are all sorts of reasons why a patient from a remote area might be more expensive. Similarly, there are reasons why an Indigenous patient might be more expensive. They might front up for care later in the course of the disease, and so have more complexity within a DRG. And so you've got to develop price adjustments for those legitimate variations based on the patient's attributes, not the attributes of the hospital. So the hospital should contain things that are the responsibility of the hospital, but the payment system takes into account things that are exogenous, that are outside the control of the hospital, including the remoteness of the patient and the Indigenous patients. There are other things you might deal with, and there are a couple of choices here. How do you deal with teaching, training, and research? In the olden days, we used to talk about teaching hospitals, and they were the big hospitals generally in the centre of the city. But almost every hospital in the country now does some form of teaching. They might have undergraduate nursing placements, for example. They might have undergraduate medical placements. They might be doing teaching and training of registrars, for example. So it's much more widespread. And so it's not teaching hospital or not teaching hospital. What you want to measure is a word that I've invented, and you won't find it in the dictionary, the teachingness of the hospital. Now, there are different ways of paying for that, but it costs more money. So do you just give a lump sum and say, yeah, we think you're this, whatever? Or do you try and measure teaching activity? And so IHPA has been, the Independent Hospital Pricing Authority, has been on a quest to actually measure how much teaching work does a hospital actually do of different kinds, medical, undergraduate, postgraduate, nursing, allied health, and what impact does that have on their costs? Because we know that if you have an assistant surgeon or a trainee surgeon doing an operation with the surgeon standing by, it will take longer and cost more. So there are legitimate costs associated with teaching, and they ought to be reimbursed or funded because we're talking about the future. So you want to make sure that these legitimate costs that describe separate products, the teaching is a different thing from the patient care, are appropriately rewarded. And so in England, in Australia, we're moving down the direction of saying this is a separate product, should be separately funded. It could be said to be an attribute of patients in some way, but as I said, I prefer the Australian way that we're doing it here. And as I said, really important that what we're talking about here is these generally are attributes of the patient, not the health service. And there are other variations, legitimate variations too. So children, for example, there are ways we need to adjust for that. Anyway, the job of the Independent Hospital Pricing Authority is to develop classifications for the multiple products, the acute inpatient classification we've talked a lot about, and all the other ones, and to determine the price weights and the price adjustments. Now, I've highlighted here in green the word independent, because as we'll learn later on, the funding flow in Australia involves the Commonwealth and the states. And you may not realise this, but there are occasional squabbles between the Commonwealth and the states. And so they wanted an independent referee that is legitimate body with expertise which can actually make a determination about what the price ought to be, and that binds the Commonwealth, and obviously it determines what the states get funded for in the flow. And I'll come back to that. In fact, I'm going to come back to that the very next thing. So how do these funding flows work? How does it work in terms of what is the role of the national efficient price and the national efficient cost? Well, in the olden days, in fact today, states are responsible for running the public hospital system. And they face the cost growth associated with the public hospital system. Both growth in demand, partly because of ageing and population growth, but that's generally not the main issue. Partly in terms of we are doing things differently. There are more things we can do now, and so there's increased admission rates. And partly because we're paying employees more for turning up for work. And that's been a big trend over the last couple of decades. So, and yet the state's taxing ability has been limited. They haven't been able to raise taxes to the extent they needed to do to keep pace with the growth in hospital costs. And hospital costs increase a couple of % faster than consumer price index. And so over time, the Commonwealth share was declining. And so the National Health and Hospital Reform Commission said, we've got to address this. We've got to actually try and ensure that the Commonwealth share doesn't decline anymore. And the Commonwealth said, yeah, we're prepared to put any more money into it, but we don't want, every dollar that we put in, the states take a dollar out. So we've got to have some form of accountability of the states. And the way they said was, well, let's measure the activity growth and the Commonwealth shares in the cost of the activity growth. And the Commonwealth said, well, I don't want to pay unlimited costs just because there's an inefficient state over here. And so the idea was there'd be a national efficient price, and the Commonwealth would pay for growth at the national efficient price, not at the state's price. And so if Western Australia or the ACT is more expensive than all the other states, which they are, then the Commonwealth says, I don't care, that's your problem, you manage that, you're the state, it's your job. We're paying nationally at the national efficient price. And so that was the deal that was done. And so that was a diversion, but basically the problem was the Commonwealth, the states' costs were growing, revenue not. Commonwealth stood aside and said, yeah, your problem, waiting times increased, and so this is where we ended up. The Commonwealth, on the left-hand side, funds the states for the increase in activity, the collective increase in activity across the country, and it's paid for bigger hospitals at the national efficient price and for smaller hospitals at the national efficient cost. And so there are two types of relevant cost growth: hospital-specific inflation and activity growth. And as I said, the activity growth is only paid for at the efficient price, and that's where the national efficient price is critical for determining the flow of funds from the Commonwealth to the states collectively. So we don't have these arguments anymore about the Commonwealth, the share of costs declining, because there's now a formula. And so what is the role of the Independent Hospital Pricing Authority? It determines the national efficient price and the national efficient cost. But how on earth does it do that? Where, just make it up? These gobsat, good old blokes sitting around tables? No, 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 no. There's actually an evidence base for it, which we'll come back to in a minute. And so the IHPA determines the national efficient price. That determines the way the Commonwealth funds hospital, states and territories, and of course in turn the states, who are the system management, fund the hospitals, and that of course means the hospitals respond to the incentives that the states create for them. So you can see on the various websites how much Commonwealth funding allegedly goes to health services. And again, this was part of the negotiations. The Commonwealth wanted accountability, and they also want to be able to say, we're putting a lot of money into the health system in your state. We want to be able to say it's going to Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, or it's going to Royal Adelaide Hospital, or Flinders Medical Centre, or whatever. So the agreement between the Commonwealth and the states, the National Health Reform Agreement it's called, says this covers public hospital services. Well, it's almost impossible to define what a public hospital is, and it's almost as difficult to define what a public hospital service is, but there's a definition. And the first element of definition is certain things are in. So inpatients are in. They are defined as a public hospital service. Secondly, everything that goes on in the emergency department is defined as a public hospital service. Thirdly, not admitted patients are defined as a public hospital service. But there are grey zones here. What about a community mental health service? Is that a public hospital service? What about a renal dialysis service in someone's home? Is that a public hospital service? Well, there had to be a set of rules about how you define some of these things. Are these things not public hospital services, or are they public hospital service? So there became a thing called the general list. And the general list is what is a public hospital service. And again, IHPA determines what's on the general list. And it tries to be independent of the setting. That is, it says, look, if it's a renal dialysis service and it's in hospital, then if it's a renal dialysis service for the same sort of patient in the patient's own home, well, we're going to count those as the same. And this is really important because technology is changing. The way we deliver care is changing. During COVID, massive shift in terms of home-based care, telehealth and all those sorts of things. So one of the principles that IHPA uses is it doesn't want to stand in the way of progress. It wants to actually try and make sure that things that evolve can be taken into account and we keep up to date. And so, you know, if you think about some of these community-based services like community mental health, chronic disease management programs, these can be counted as public hospital services if a few criteria are actually met. And the first one is it has to be linked to the clinical services and clinical governance structures of the health service. So, for example, if there's a mental health services provided by an independent community health centre, such as we have in Victoria, where the public hospital is not accountable for what goes on, and if there's something goes wrong, it's not the hospital's responsibility, that doesn't sound like a public hospital service. But if there's a community mental health service where the employees are employees of the hospital, and if something goes wrong, it's the hospital's clinical governance processes that kick in, so there's more integration into the clinical governance process, it sounds more like a public hospital service. The more severe the disease, it sounds more like a public hospital service. The more there's regular intensive contact with the group, it sounds more like a public hospital service. The more there's formal starting and ending points, it sounds like admission and discharge. And the more people are admitted, like a hospital in the home, it sounds more like a public hospital service. Now, these are matters of judgment, but IHPA is the one that makes a call. Is this service a public hospital service or is it not? And it is a public hospital service, it gets included on what's called the general list. Now, I'll just give you an example of all of this. In Victoria recently, we had the release of the Royal Commission into Victorian Mental Health Services. And in that report, it had this diagram about how it saw the world developing in mental health in Victoria. And it had these wedges here, and these first two are support from their communities and primary care services, and these last three are short-term treatment and ongoing intensive treatment. And if you think about it, these sound more like public hospital services, and these sound more like primary care services. These don't sound so much, even though they talk about support from secondary mental health services, these sound more like they're not public hospital services. So you can think about a way of dividing up the mental health service world in Victoria into things that look more like public hospital services and things that don't look like public hospital services to the same extent. So this consideration of what is a public hospital service, setting independent, not within the four walls of a public hospital, is a really important consideration right now in the consideration of the Royal Commission to Mental Health Services. So I said that that circle is about these are more like public hospital services. So I now want to talk a bit more about how this national efficient price comes about. So basically we've got hospitals over here, and hospitals obviously have costs. And over here we've got the Independent Hospital Pricing Authority, and they have prices. And how do you get from one to the other? Well, the first instance, those prices, IHPA does some calculations and actually sets the so-called price weights. Importantly, the costs in aggregate of hospitals inform those price weights. So on the one hand, we have hospitals with costs, and on the other hand, they inform the prices that are used then to set the prices and the revenue that states collectively get. Now, I've said costs in aggregate. The costs of an individual hospital don't influence, well, they do influence in a minor way the total, but basically we're looking at the national efficient price. So if a hospital is more expensive and another, that's the hospital's own concern. So how do we get from those costs, those hospital costs, to those prices and those price weights? Well, the important thing is there's obviously a timing lag because, you know, the costs of a hospital are created, and then you have to collect the data, and then you have to analyse the data, and then you have to warn states that you're going to actually use this data. So there's the costs and the prices have a little time lag between them, so you've got to adjust from the costs of that year to the prices of this year. So the National Efficient Price Determination of 2021-22 uses data from 2019 and then inflates them up, basically. So here we see the history of the data, and these are the national efficient prices. And so you see they've gone up, and they've gone up faster than inflation because hospital costs go up faster than inflation across public and private sector. So you've seen this slide before. This slide talks about the language, and you remember price weight and the base price. Well, the price weight comes from this data from hospitals. And so we collect data, the IHPA collects data on all of the patients discharged in the biggest hospitals in the country in a process called the National Hospital Cost Data Collection, collects data about appendectomy patients with minor complexity, DRG G07B, and looks at what the average is of the average patient in that, and that ends up, as it turns out, to yield a relativity, a price weight of 1.2583, and that base price for the national efficient price. So every hospital is different. So how do you make sure that they're talking about the same thing? Well, the first thing you've got to do is to have standards for how you're going to collect data. So the Independent Hospital Pricing Authority has determined a set of costing standards. You remember right back I said there are rules associated with activity-based funding? These are one of them. And so there's a set of patient costing standards which determine how they collect the information. So an individual hospital has its own chart of accounts. How does it allocate year end and all those sorts of things, so there's consistency across hospitals. The second thing they do is this determines how the data are collected. It's then input into the National Hospital Cost Data Collection to its friends. It's called NHCDC. Maybe it doesn't have any friends if that's what it's called. But anyway, so it's a data set which has patient-level data about the diagnoses, the procedures, comorbidities, complications, age, gender, where the patient lived, Indigenous status, not Indigenous status, patient-level data, and costs associated with each of those patients. So a huge data set which has got patient-level diagnosis and dollar information, and then these costs are grouped into cost buckets, and I'll come back to those in a minute. And as part of that data collection, there was 507 hospitals in 2018-19, the biggest hospitals, accounting for $50 billion of expenditure. A lot of numbers, a lot of data in that. And all of that informs the price weight. So it is an evidence-based process involving a lot of analysis about transforming the cost data from the hospitals into the prices that are used, both the base price, the $5,000 number, and the weight, the 1.2 number. Now I mentioned cost buckets. Well, basically you need to know a level of detail. Well, they don't just collect information about the total costs of an appendectomy. They talk about how much is salaries and wages on nurses, how much is salaries and wages on doctors, how much is imaging, how much is pathology. And these cost centre groups are calculated, individual line items are calculated, and they're grouped together into coherent bundles. How much is spent altogether on emergency department services for imaging and pathology, how much altogether is spent on pathology, and so on. And so those buckets are an important unit of analysis. But the critical point is the end point, the total costs And the idea is that these buckets are roughly coherent. Importantly, they are used to determine the difference between public patients in public hospitals and private patients in public hospitals. Because private patients, the state government, for example, doesn't pay for the medical costs, doesn't pay for pathology, doesn't pay for radiology, for example. And so you've got to say, well, those cost buckets are not included for that purpose. So these cost buckets are an important part of the unit of analysis. So then we come to the final bit. Obviously, there's a cost there per unit of input. Then we have inputs per unit of output. This is essentially about technical efficiency. How many days per appendectomy patient, how many meals per appendectomy patient, what is the cost per meal, what is the cost per day of stay. Important information for management. But this is not where the world ends. We also have to start caring about what happens to that patient. Is there differences in the rate of people who die, for example? So we've got to start thinking about the outcomes of care. To what extent? We've got to start thinking about patient-reported outcomes, and I'll come back to that in a second. So yes, the focus has been on that end of that spectrum, but we've also got to think about the longer term. So this is where we come to think about how might activity-based funding evolve or not evolve. So if we start thinking about the future, and I just want to raise 3 issues. What do we mean by output? I told you that we've got an activity-based funding system, an acute classification system called DRGs, and a separate classification for rehabilitation, for example. The evidence was across the world that there started to be a bit of an unbundling and rehab services started to increase. Should we rebundle? Should we say a hip replacement involves an expectation of this amount of rehab? And so instead of just paying for the hip replacement and driving efficiency in the acute phase of the hip replacement episode, we look at the total episode and say, let's look at both the acute and the rehab component and let's try and drive efficiency over that broader definition of an episode. And that's one of the things IHPA, the Independent Hospital Pricing Authority, is working on. So we need to think about how do we define that output. The second thing is, what about this stuff about outcomes? How do we start to make sure that we're paying for the same thing? Because you can put an incentive on a hospital to actually drive efficiency, but they might drive efficiency inappropriately by providing poorer quality care. In general, poorer quality care costs more money than better quality care, by the way, because you end up with adverse events, and adverse events cost a lot of money, but you've got to worry about how much focus are we putting on quality and outcomes. And an increasingly important trend is outcomes from the perspective of the patient. And the jargon is PROMs, which stands for patient-reported outcome measures. And so we might start to have a broader incorporation of these quality measures in health services. But should every patient be in hospital? What we know is on average, arthroscopy for osteoarthritis of the knee doesn't yield any benefit. So-called low value or no value care. Should we be paying for that? How should that be incorporated in the future in our activity-based funding arrangement? What about potentially avoidable hospitalisations, say admissions for vaccine preventable diseases? What sorts of incentives should be on health services or states to actually manage vaccine preventable diseases, to maximise immunisation rollout? And finally, you've got to think about the dynamic world that we're in, that we want to make sure that the workforce is going to be there in the future. We've got to actually make sure that our health services are contributing to the future and also looking to the future in what the health services do and how they do their staffing and so on, so-called dynamic efficiency. And so we do need to incorporate outcomes and the future and so on into our thinking about activity-based funding. So that's it. Thank you very much. I've tried to, in this presentation, describe the general context of activity-based funding, where it sits in policy and where it sits in terms of different ways of funding health services and why you might go with activity-based funding and why you might not. I've then talked a bit about the history, I've talked a bit about the mechanics, how activity-based funding works. What is the national efficient price? What is the national efficient cost? And where they come from. And so we've tried to give you a rounded picture. It's obviously only an introduction. There are people who spend their lives working on these sorts of things. But this is just to give you a taster, to try and understand more about activity-based funding. Thank you very much for watching it. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you feel like you've learned something.